Today we are beginning a brand new series called My Dysfunctional Family, My Dysfunctional Family. And I want to tell you up front where we're going and what we're doing with this, all right? So today is just an introduction. We're not going to give you a lot of answers. You're going to have a lot of questions when you leave. That's okay. That's normal. You didn't do anything wrong. That's the way it was designed. But then next week, we are going to give you a question that I think is the most helpful question that you could ever ask in your family. As a matter of fact, I hope it becomes your family's favorite question. It's a question, it doesn't matter if you're a Jesus follower or not, this question will work for you. This question works for everybody. We're going to talk about that next week. Third week, I'm going to talk about conflict. I know you don't have any conflict in your family, but you're going to need to give advice to somebody else who does, right? So we're going to talk about not only what causes conflict in families. You're like, I know, they do. We'll talk about that. Not only what causes conflict, but I want to give you a hack, if you will, a little trick, a simple thing to do whenever there's conflict in your family. And I'm going to tell you now, and I'll tell you in 2 weeks. I am terrible at this. I'm trying to get better at myself. But a simple little thing to do whenever conflict starts to arise that'll help alleviate some of the conflict in your family. That's the third week. And then the fourth week, we're going to talk about what to do with those family relationships that are just awkward. You know, the ones where there are issues, but nobody really wants to talk about anymore. It's just awkward with your dad or awkward when your sister's around or whatever it is. You try to ignore the elephant in the room, but you can't really ignore it. But anyway, you know what all that's like. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to give you a plan. Now listen carefully, a plan that will not guarantee reconciliation with people in your family, but a plan that will increase the odds that you might be able to experience reconciliation with people in your family. So that's where we're going with the series. And the other thing I should warn you about, it's not happening today because they're all at camp and doing their deal. But starting next week for the rest of the series, our 6th, 7th, and 8th graders from Transit, we're shutting Transit down and bringing them in here. So they're going to be in here with all of us. And you say, well, why would you do that? Well, because their parents bribed me to do that. No, there's some stuff that we're talking about in this series that we were like, you know what? If everybody in the family heard it at the same time, it might lead to some great conversations. So that's why we're doing that. So it's going to be a lot of fun. At the same time, it's really challenging. And the reason it's challenging is because every single family is diverse. So as I'm planning this series and putting it together and writing this stuff, I'm like, man, the hard part is no two families look just alike. Some of you grew up in families that would have been called more traditional families. Some of you grew up in, or you have now, blended families. For some of you grew up and you're raised by a step parent. Some of you, you don't have any kids, you're not married, but you still got your family of origin you're navigating with. Some of you have gotten married, and now that you are married and you started your family, you got that whole deal. But for some of you don't have kids yet. Others of you, you're raising somebody else's kids. Others of you, you're fostering kids. Others of you, you're adopting kids. It's like, everybody's got a little bit of a different deal. So I thought, okay, what do we have in common when it comes to families? And I came up with 2 things. There's probably more than 2. You're smarter than me. You can come up with some more. But I came up with 2 things we all have in common. The first one is this. When it comes to our family of origin, we don't have a choice. We do all have that in common, right? You get to pick your friends. You don't get to pick your family. So, and the odd thing is I was thinking about this. Whenever we were younger, do you remember there were times where you wished you could pick your family because you would have picked a different one? It usually happens in middle or high school where you've got a friend and you go over to their house to spend the night and it's like, oh my gosh, their family is amazing. What is wrong with mine? Because dad's so fun and mom had no rules and you got to eat cake for breakfast and cereal for dinner. It was just like, oh my gosh, I wish I was in your family. So all of us have had those moments, but we don't get to pick. You can pick your friends, can't pick your family. The other thing that's common for all of us is that family is difficult. It just is. Every family is dysfunctional in some way. And if we sat down and started talking, we'd start sharing our stories and we'd all end up saying the same thing. In each of our family experiences, there's good, there's bad, there's pain, there's joy. There are memories that we love to share, and there are memories that, man, we just hate to even think about. There's just a mix, isn't it? Happiness and sorrow. Every family has their stuff, and it looks different for all of us, but every family has their stuff. And if it makes you feel like, oh my gosh, my family's worse than, no, your family's not worse than anybody else's. We all have dysfunctional families. And maybe this will be encouraging. Your family is probably better than most any family you can find in the scriptures. You want to talk about some really dysfunctional families. There is no good role model for a family in the scriptures. You can talk about Adam and Eve. They blew perfection. Talk about dysfunction. They messed it up for all of us. And then the first murder that happened in history was one of their sons killed their other son. That's pretty dysfunctional. You could talk about David, and good grief, he had all kinds of issues with women, and then his kids were all messed up because of things David did. David had a son who, that son raped his half-sister, and then another son killed that son because of what he had done, and then the son that had killed the other son ended up starting a coup and trying to overthrow David, started a civil war in the country. It was a mess for decades in David's family. You can even look at Jesus' own family, and I'm going to tread lightly because you grew up Catholic, I know. But Mary and Joseph, they're great people. But you do remember when Jesus was 12 years old, they're all in Jerusalem, and they lost Jesus. They left him in Jerusalem. It took them 3 days to realize they lost him. Okay? Some of you've left your kids here at church, but you didn't wait till Wednesday to come pick them up. Nor would we have let you, by the way, if you're getting any ideas. It's not. So, they're good parents, but they had their issues. And then, you may not know this, but before Jesus' death and resurrection, Jesus' brothers and sisters, and he had a lot of them, Jesus' brothers and sisters were going around saying, we think Jesus is mentally unstable because he keeps telling everybody he's God, and we grew up with this kid. It's like they thought he was crazy. There is no good role model, which is why when you open up the scriptures, I'll tell you what you find. You don't find New Testament writers saying, hey, you should all try to have a family like. What you find is New Testament writers describing the way God intended for the family to operate, the way God intended for the family to function, the way God intended family members to behave towards and relate to one another. That's what you find them describing. The problem with that, and we're about to talk about this for the next 4 weeks, so I decided I need to take a whole Sunday at the beginning to address this. Because the problem with looking at the description that the New Testament writers paint of how we should behave towards and relate to one another's family, the problem is it creates a huge tension that you are going to be tempted over the next few weeks. Quite honestly, we're already tempted. A tension we're tempted to relieve, a tension that we are tempted to alleviate. But when you try to escape or alleviate this tension, well, it actually is worse for you. It is not better. Let me see if I can explain the tension this way. All of us, when it comes to family, know there is an ideal, okay? The ideal is the way you always dreamed your family would be, the way you hoped your family would relate to one another. The ideal is the way God described and designed family to function. The ideal is what Jesus actually came and introduced to the world. All right, so there's an ideal, but you also all know that there's the real. The real is how your family actually operates and how people in your family actually relate to one another and how, your kids or your parents or your siblings behave towards one another. That's the real. And between the ideal and the real, there is a massive gap. Massive gap. I see nobody's writing this down because you don't need to, right? It's like, we get it. This is obvious. There's a massive gap. But here's what I want you to understand. The gap is where we messed up. The gap is where we get stuck. The gap is where the tension lies. Because there is a tendency for all of us, whenever the reality of what we want, of what our family is, whenever it doesn't line up and match up with the ideal of what we want our family to be, there's a temptation for all of us to try to shrink or lower or slide down the ideal until it's closer to the real, so there's not the disappointment, so there's not the tension, so we don't have to face the fact that we're not living up to the kind of family that we actually hoped we would one day have. There is a temptation on all of our parts to relieve this tension. But to relieve this tension actually costs you something. This is what we're going to talk about today. To relieve this tension costs you something. To relieve this tension is going to keep you from experiencing the best kind of family experience you could possibly experience. But there is a temptation on all of our parts whenever we realize the ideal's not happening. Whenever we realize the ideal's never going to happen. Whenever we realize, oh my gosh, we've already made choices as a family or done things as a family that the ideal is out the window. We can't recapture that. It's impossible to get it back. There's a tendency in all of us to want to say, okay, I'm just going to lower the ideal and accept what's real. But in the midst of doing that, you miss something. So what I want to do today is I want to show you how Jesus modeled for us how to handle this tension. And I want to ask you whether you're willing to embrace the tension the way Jesus invited us to, instead of lowering the ideal, the expectation, the standard, if you will, of what you hope your family experiences. And I need to warn you up front, the way I'm going to illustrate this, I could have illustrated in a lot of different ways, because Jesus held on to both the ideal and the real in a lot of different scenarios when he was on the earth. So when you read the accounts of his life, you see him do this all the time. But I want to show you an example of when he did it in a way that for some of you is going to be super personal, and that's why I'm warning you. For some of you is going to be emotional. For some of you is going to be uncomfortable. And when I introduce this topic, when you see where this is going, if you've been around here a long time, you're going to know where this is going to land, so you're not going to be worried. But I need to tell those of you who may be newer and have had some terrible experiences with other pastors or other churches or other Christians, when it comes to this topic, I just need to tell you to take a deep breath and relax, okay? Because we're not going to end where you may think it's going to end. But Jesus models for us, and I wanted to use this because it's, this creates so much tension, this issue does. But Jesus models for us in the middle of an extraordinarily tense, personal, emotional subject matter, how you can accept the reality of what is and yet not let go of the ideal of what you hoped it would be, and why holding on to both is actually what's best for you. So, Matthew, who was one of Jesus' disciples and was around and saw all these things take place, Matthew records for us a conversation that happened one day. Here's what he says. He says some Pharisees, so religious leaders in Jerusalem at the time or in Israel, some Pharisees came to Jesus to test him. They were always testing him. And the reason they were testing him is because they were trying to get Jesus to say something that would discredit him in front of the crowd, and so he would lose influence with the crowd. That's what they hated the most. He had so much influence with so many people. So they're trying to get him to, say something or do something that'll tick a bunch of people off. And this is a topic, and you're going to understand why. This is a topic they thought might work. So they asked Jesus, hey, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Now, the Jewish people in their culture had a version of no-fault divorce that worked kind of like this. At any point, if the man decided he no longer wanted to be married to his wife, he had to say 3 times, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and the marriage was over. That was it. I know, it's like, are you kidding me? No, that was it. There were no attorneys, no judge, no legal fees, no alimony payments, no splitting assets 50-50. It was, dinner was not good tonight. I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. I'm done with, It was that simple. And you're going, this is so, yeah, of course it was terribly unfair. The men had all of the power. But if a husband did that, the wife had to go gather what few belongings she could claim as her own and walk out the door. This is the way it worked, okay? So they're looking at Jesus going, all right, Jesus, well, we got this whole thing going on with divorce, and a lot of men are using it to divorce their wives, and so we just want to know from you, is it lawful to do it? Now, the trap here is that this method of managing, rocky marriage relationships, well, this solution had been implemented by Moses centuries before. Moses, like the most important figure in Jewish culture. Moses, like, oh my gosh, you never go against what Moses says. So they have gathered or caught enough of how Jesus is taught to go, Jesus isn't going to be for this whole man gets to say it 3 times and woman's out the door kind of divorce. It's not the way he operates. He's going to call this out. But when he calls it out, he's going to be calling Moses out. And then everybody's going to be ticked with him because he criticized Moses, right? So this is the trap. And they're waiting for Jesus to say, no, there's a better way to handle divorce. And instead, Jesus takes them in an entirely different direction. He looks back at them and he says, haven't you read? And he's talking about in their Jewish scriptures. Haven't you read that at the beginning? We're not asking about at the beginning. We're asking about what to do when a guy's upset with his wife. And he says, no. I want to take you back to the ideal. I'm going to take you all the way back to how God intended for a marriage relationship to work. He says, haven't you read at the beginning that the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Haven't you read that? They're going, yeah, we read that. And then Jesus looks at them and he says, So they're no longer two, but one flesh. So all right, when two people get married, it's not two independent people anymore. They're united. They're one. I don't have time to go into this today, but over the years we have learned that from a biological standpoint, this actually happens, that when two people bond like this, that these are bonds that you can't just dissipate and that move on as if it never happened. He's going, no, there's a unity there. Therefore, what God's joined together, Jesus says, let no one separate. Jesus is going, all right, I know what you guys are getting at, and I know what you're wanting to know, but the question you're asking me is actually irrelevant. It's irrelevant. I want to talk about the ideal, Jesus says. I want to talk about the kind of family relationships that God created, designed, and intended for us to have. The kind of relationships where a man and a woman marry and they are united together. One team, same page for life. And you guys have gotten used to what's going on, and Jesus would say, I get that. I understand that these relationships, these marriages, they don't always work out. I understand people get divorced sometimes. I understand the reality of what's going on in our culture. I get that. But I don't want to start by figuring out what's the best way to deal with reality. I want to start by talking about the ideal, not the real. We'll get to the real. We'll figure that piece out. But I don't want us to lose sight of what was originally intended. Now, at this point, all these Pharisees are like, we don't even know what to do with this. We're just trying to get you caught in a little trap here because this is common now. Everybody just accepts that, yeah. Divorces happen. They're going to happen all the time. And dear Jesus is kind of wading into these waters like it would be today going, no. You don't lose sight of the ideal. And they're going, well, I don't even know what to do with this at this point. So they have questions, right? They have more questions, and they kind of set him up. So they look back at him, and they say this, why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? All right, wait a minute. If you're telling me that God intended for two people to be married forever, then why in the world would Moses, because Moses, he's close to God, Moses spoke on behalf of God, why in the world would Moses come up with this idea where a man could divorce his wife to begin with? If that wasn't the ideal, if that wasn't just part of the plan, was Moses wrong? Or they're setting the trap. Was Moses wrong? You want to tell all these people here Moses was wrong? And Jesus looks back at him and he says this, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Translation, because y'all don't always get it right. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because sometimes you just can't figure out how to relate to and behave with one another in a healthy way. So Moses came up with a plan and a solution for the reality of what you were experiencing. But it was not this way. It was not intended to be this way. It was not designed to be this way from the beginning. To which, if we'd all been there, we'd have said, okay, Jesus, well, that was pretty clear. So tell me something. What are you going to do to all those divorced people then? And Jesus says, I'm not doing anything to them. I'm doing something for them. I'm actually going to die on a cross to pay the penalty for all their sins and for all their gaps and for all the times they've, hurt her and hurt him and hurt the kids and all. I'm going to give my life for the mess they've created. I'm not here to do anything to them. I'm going to hold on to the ideal, and I'm going to extend grace to them and their reality. I'm going to fill the gap with my forgiveness. But I'm not letting go of one to make the other one more acceptable. Now, this is the tension when it comes to family that we all have to wrestle with. Because all of us know, I don't have to convince you of this, all of us know we have an ideal, and then we know what happens at home, we know what's real. And you know how big this gap is, and so do I. And the tension is, are you willing to hold on to both at the same time and be uncomfortable in the tension? Are you willing to say, I'm not letting go of this standard, of this ideal? I know we fall way short of it as a family, but I'm not letting go of this. I know we're never going to meet it. I'm still not letting go of this. I'm just going to live in the gap in the middle. Are you willing to do that? Now, let me tell you why you can do that. Don't miss this. Because when Jesus showed up, the expectations got higher and his grace ran deeper. The standard got higher, but his forgiveness runs richer. Now, you take Jesus out of the equation, and none of us want to live in this gap. You know why? Because this gap creates a lot of guilt and shame. So none of us want to live there. But when you have a Savior who said, no, I took care of all your mess in the gap. I took care of all the shame and the guilt. You don't have to feel guilty anymore. I took care of all that. You got forgiveness. You got grace. My grace is available for you. When you understand that, then you don't have to worry about guilt. You can actually hold on to the ideal and say, I don't meet it, but I don't feel guilty about it. I don't meet it. I'm going to keep striving for it, but I'm forgiven for all the times I fall short of it. Now, if you don't understand grace and forgiveness, if that's not something that's been personal to you, then I'll tell you what you're going to do. You're going to always be trying to slide this down until the ideal and the real meet up. You're going to convince yourself that the reality of your situation is good enough. The reality of your situation is as good as it's going to be. It's okay, it's fine, everybody does it. But you lose something when you do that. Let me see if I can illustrate it this way. Have you ever met a man or a woman who's divorced who hopes their kid one day gets divorced? No, of course you haven't. Have you ever met a mom or a dad who said, I'll tell you what, I hope one day my daughter marries a guy who, when they get older, he decides to trade her in for a newer model? Of course you haven't. You're like, that's ridiculous. Who would do that? You know why? Because every divorced parent understands that the ideal is actually best. And every divorced parent wants the ideal for their kid, even though they didn't live up to the ideal. Because you know. But to let go of the ideal is actually to let go of what's best. And so Jesus' point in this is not, oh my gosh, you should feel so terrible because look at the gap that's in your life between where you should be and where you are. That's not his point. He's like, no, I paid for that gap. He lived a life we couldn't live, died a death that we needed him to die, to pay a penalty we couldn't pay. He took care of all the guilt, shame, all the shortfalls in the gap. But he's going, please do not let go of the ideal. Please aim for the ideal. Please make the ideal the North Star of your family. And you're never going to reach it. But if it's not the North Star, if you don't hold on to it, you'll never get close to it. If you just lower it and accept the reality of the way your family relates to and behaves towards one another, then there is nothing that'll ever help you get better and healthier as a family. So, my question for you, as we go throughout this series, is simply this. Are you willing to hold on to the ideal while being honest about the real at the exact same time? Are you willing to do that in your family? Are you willing to do that with your parents, with your kids, with your siblings? Are you willing to deal with the tension that comes when you don't let go of either one of them? Over the next few weeks, the stuff we're going to talk about, every week is going to be stuff that you're going to go, we don't do that very well. I know. My family doesn't either. But you don't want to let go of trying. Because to let go of trying means you settle for something that's worse for you, that's unhealthy for you, and for the people that you love the most. You got to have something that you're walking towards, that you're aiming for, that you're moving to, it's going to help you keep growing. So whenever you feel that tension, don't try to resolve it. Just own it. Just own it. This week, pay attention to the times where you are trying to alleviate the tension. Because I bet you're doing it in some different parts of your life. Pay attention to the points where you're trying to justify certain behaviors or actions and in essence lower the ideal. Because you don't want to have to acknowledge there's such a gap between reality and the standard. Pay attention to it. But remember, the expectations are higher, but the grace runs deeper. The standard's higher, but the forgiveness is richer. Jesus took care of all that in the gap. All you have to do is accept his forgiveness for it. You don't have to carry around any guilt and shame. There is zero condemnation for people who follow Jesus, for people who accept his forgiveness. There's no condemnation. So let his love and his forgiveness and his grace motivate you to keep moving towards the ideal, even if you may never get there. And quite honestly, none of us will. But how about you let it motivate you to do that so that you can model for the people you love and care about the most a better way of living and behaving and relating as family. Let me pray for us. Father, thanks for sending Jesus to show us how it was intended to be, how you designed us to be. And it does make us uncomfortable sometimes. But just help us to remember whenever we feel that tension that it's okay that we fall short. All that's already taken care of. Thank you, Jesus, for offering us enough grace and forgiveness that it fills that gap fully. We can't ever outrun it. For those who maybe have never experienced that personally or never realized that they're forgiven for all that, my prayer is that in this moment they'll just accept your forgiveness, because that's all it takes. That they'll just acknowledge there's a gap and they want your forgiveness for it. And then let your love and your grace and your forgiveness be the thing that motivates us to keep striving and praying and working and serving for better in our families. Because you have a beautiful way of taking the reality of what is and turning it into something better when we trust you with it. That's in your name we pray. Amen.